All right, welcome back everybody to the deep dive. You know the drill, right? We take all that crazy information out there and we find the stuff that really matters, the stuff that will make you think, whoa, I did not know that.
Exactly. Sometimes you've got like a stack of articles or maybe even some research papers, and it's just, too much.
It's a lot, it's overwhelming.
Yeah, and you just want someone to tell you what's important, right? What do I really need to know from all of this?
That's what we're doing here, breaking it all down for you. And speaking of breaking things down, you gave us some super interesting material for this deep dive, all about what's called, get this, emotional designs in multimedia learning. Now, I got to admit, when I first heard that, I was like, what? Emotional designs, what is that?
Yeah, it sounds kind of out there, right? But
Yeah,
actually, you see it all the time. It's all those little things and learning materials that are meant to, make you feel something.
yeah.
Things like colors, shapes, even little cartoon characters. It's basically the idea that how you feel while you're learning can actually change how well you learn.
Okay, so it's not just about cramming information into your brain. It's about how you feel while you're doing it. Interesting. So for this deep dive, we're really focused on one huge study. It's a meta-analysis by Wong and Ediso from 2021. And just to be clear for everyone, a meta-analysis is basically a study of studies. So they took a whole bunch of existing research on emotional designs and combined it all to try to get a big picture answer. And that big question is, do these emotional designs actually work?
Yeah, do they actually make a difference for you? You've probably seen it yourself, right? Like you're taking an online course or watching a presentation, and it's all decked out with bright colors and graphics. And you probably wondered, is this actually helping me learn or is it just distracting me?
Right, like is it style over substance?
Yeah.
And it sounds like the research out there has been kind of mixed. Some studies saying emotional designs are great, others saying not so much. So our goal today is to untangle all of that for you.
Exactly. We're going to go deep and hopefully give you a clearer understanding of whether these emotional designs are worth paying attention to or if they're just, a bunch of fluff.
All right, so let's jump right in. First things first, what did this big meta-analysis actually find?
Okay, so the main takeaway is actually pretty positive. When they looked at all the research together, they found that overall, emotional designs do seem to have a positive impact on learning outcomes. They saw a moderate positive effect on what they call retention. So basically, how well you remember information.
So it's not just about being entertained. It actually helps you learn and remember the stuff. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And it's not just about retention either. They also found positive effects on transfer, which is basically your ability to take what you learn and apply it to new situations, make it useful, and also on general comprehension, like how well you understand the material overall.
Okay, so we're talking about actual, learning benefits. But it gets even more interesting. Tell me about the impact on how people felt while they were learning.
Right, so this is really key. The meta-analysis also showed that emotional designs had a positive impact on things like positive emotions. Basically, people just felt better while they were learning. And it also boosted their intrinsic motivation.
Intrinsic motivation, that's like the inner drive to learn something, right? Not because you have to, but because you genuinely want to.
Exactly. And it even seems like people were willing to put in more mental effort when emotional designs were used. Plus, they reported liking the learning materials more, and the material actually seemed easier to them, which, I mean, come on, who wouldn't want that?
Right, sign me up for the Make Learning Easier program. But, okay, you said there was a but here. Spill the beans.
Okay, so here's the caveat. While most of these outcomes did show a positive trend, how consistent those effects were, that varied quite a bit across the different studies they looked at. For example, things like comprehension, how difficult the material felt, and how much people enjoyed it, those results were pretty consistent. So, good news there. But when it came to retention, transfer, mental effort, intrinsic motivation, and those positive emotions, the results were more all over the place.
Which basically tells us that there are definitely other factors at play here.
Okay, so emotional designs can be helpful, but it's not like a magic bullet that works every single time. Makes sense to me. So let's get into the why here. What's the underlying thinking behind how these emotional designs might actually work to improve learning?
Right, good question. So the researchers leaned heavily on a theory called the cognitive affective theory of learning with media, or KDLM for short. It's a mouthful, I know. But basically, KDLM says that learning isn't just about the information itself, but also about how you feel while you're learning. Your emotions and your motivation play a big role. So it's about the whole experience for you, not just the facts and figures.
Exactly. The basic idea is that positive emotions can actually boost your motivation to learn. And when you're more motivated, you're more likely to really engage the material, process it deeply, try to understand it, make connections. They call this generative processing. And that deeper level of processing, that's what leads to better learning and remembering.
It makes sense to me. If you're enjoying yourself, you're probably going to pay more attention and think harder about what you're learning, right?
Exactly. But, and this is important, the theory also acknowledges that emotional designs can backfire. If they're not done well, they can actually have the opposite effect.
Uh-oh. How so?
So, poorly designed emotional elements can actually increase what's called extraneous processing. That's basically mental effort that's not focused on the actual learning task. So, if you're trying to figure out a confusing graphic or you're distracted by something that's just, there for decoration, your brain is using up energy that could be spent actually learning the material.
So it's like you're trying to study for a test, but you keep getting sidetracked by all the cool pictures in the textbook. You might enjoy it more, but you're not actually learning as effectively.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this kind of delicate balance, right? Emotional designs have to be carefully thought out to really work. It's this idea of emotion as facilitator versus emotion as suppressor, which was a framework that came from researchers, Plass and others back in 2012. Basically, emotions can either help you learn or get in the way, depending on how they're used.
Okay, so it's about finding that sweet spot where emotions are working for you, not against you. I like that. So let's get into the specifics here. What kinds of emotional designs did this meta-analysis actually look at? What are we talking about here in practical terms?
So they mainly focused on two types, colors and what they call anthropomorphic graphics. Colors are pretty straightforward, and the research suggests that people generally prefer warmer, brighter, more saturated colors, things like bright yellows and oranges, things like that.
Makes sense. Those colors tend to evoke more positive feelings. And what about these, what do you call them, anthropomorphic graphics? What is that in plain English?
Basically, it means giving human-like qualities to things that aren't human. So adding a face to a cartoon sun or giving a robot character big, expressive eyes, things like that. And research has shown that these human-like features can actually make learning materials more engaging and easier to understand.
Like you're more likely to pay attention to a friendly-looking cartoon character than just a plain shape.
Yeah. And studies have found that these anthropomorphic features can make learning more enjoyable and even improve comprehension. However, there is a warning here. The researchers in this meta-analysis also point out the danger of what they call seductive details.
Ooh, seductive details. That sounds interesting. Tell me more.
So seductive details are basically design elements that look really cool and interesting, but they're not actually relevant to the learning content. They might be fun to look at, but they can also distract you from the important stuff and end up hurting your learning.
So it's not just about making things look flashy. It has to actually serve a purpose.
Exactly. The emotional design needs to be intentionally connected to the learning content, not just thrown in there for decoration.
Okay, so emotional design is not as simple as it might sound. There's a real art to doing it effectively. Which leads us to the next question. When do these emotional designs actually make the biggest difference? What are the factors that can change how well they work?
Right, so the meta-analysis really digs into that, and they break it down into a few different categories. First, there's the type of emotional design used.
So not all colors and smiley faces are created equal.
Not exactly, no. So for retention, how well you remember things, they found that using either anthropomorphic shapes alone or colors alone actually worked better than using them together. It seems counterintuitive, but the designs that mix both actually had the smallest impact on memory.
Interesting. You'd think that more emotional cues would be better, but maybe there's something about that simplicity that makes it easier for your brain to latch onto.
That's one theory. And then when they looked at mental effort and intrinsic motivation, anthropomorphic shapes by themselves were the most effective. And get this, sometimes using colors alone actually led to people reporting less mental effort.
Huh. So maybe the colors were actually making things too easy or too passive, like they weren't having to think as hard.
That's possible. And then, for positive emotions, it was the combination of shapes and colors that worked best. So it really seems to depend on what specific outcome you're aiming for.
It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You really have to think about what you're trying to achieve. Okay, so the design itself matters. What about the learner? Do individual differences play a role here?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest factors they looked at was grade level. It turns out that emotional designs had a much larger positive effect on retention for elementary school students compared to older students.
That makes sense. Younger kids are probably more drawn to visual elements and easily engaged by them.
Right. And they saw similar trends for mental effort and intrinsic motivation, with the effects generally being stronger for students in K-12 compared to college students. So it seems like emotional designs might be particularly helpful for younger learners.
Interesting. Okay, so age matters. What about cultural differences?
Yeah, they looked at that too, and they did find some differences in intrinsic motivation and positive affect across different cultural groups. Specifically, they looked at American, Chinese, and German participants. And they found that Americans and Germans showed higher intrinsic motivation with emotional designs, while Chinese participants actually showed a bigger increase in positive emotions.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach across cultures either. Makes you think about how those cultural differences might play out and how people respond to different design elements.
Right, culture definitely shapes how we perceive and respond to emotions. Okay, so we've talked about the design itself and the learner. What about how the learning material is actually presented? Does that make a difference?
Yeah, good question. Does it matter if it's a video or a website or a textbook? What did they find?
So one thing they looked at was whether the material was animated or just static. And surprisingly, static materials, like just pictures or text, actually led to higher reported mental effort and intrinsic motivation compared to animated materials.
Wow, really? I would have thought animation would be more engaging.
It seems counterintuitive, right? But one theory is that maybe with static materials, you have to work a little harder to process the information, which can actually make you more invested and motivated. But for retention, animation did show a slightly larger positive effect, though it wasn't statistically significant.
So maybe animation helps you remember things better, but static images make you work harder and feel more driven to learn. It's all about finding that right balance.
Exactly. Another presentation feature they looked at was pacing, meaning who controls how fast you go through the material. And they found that when learners were able to control the pace themselves, emotional designs had a bigger positive impact on their intrinsic motivation compared to when the pace was set for them.
Makes sense. When you have control, you can go at your own speed and really engage with the parts that resonate with you.
Yeah, it's like the emotional elements connect more deeply with your own learning process when you have that control. Okay, so we've covered the design, the learner, and how the material is presented. What about the context of the learning itself? Does that play a role?
Yeah, like, doesn't matter what you're learning. Does a cartoon sun work better for math or for history?
So they looked at that too, and they found that the effectiveness of emotional designs on retention varied quite a bit depending on the subject area, what they call the learning domain. Subjects that were categorized as other, meaning not life sciences or physical sciences, those showed the biggest positive effect on retention. And for intrinsic motivation, life sciences and those other domains saw positive effects, but physical sciences actually didn't.
Huh, that's really interesting. So maybe a cartoon character might help you remember something in history class more than something in physics class. I wonder why that is.
It's a good question. Maybe it has something to do with how abstract the concepts are or how much prior knowledge you have about the subject. More research is needed to really unpack that. Finally, they looked at instructional time, and they found that when people spent a moderate amount of time learning, somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, emotional designs seemed to have a greater impact on mental effort and positive affect compared to very short or very long learning sessions.
So there's a sweet spot for you. Too short, and maybe the emotional elements don't have enough time to sink in. Too long, and maybe you get bored or habituated to them.
Yeah, exactly. The duration of the learning experience definitely seems to play a role. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. And I think the main takeaway is that emotional design is not some simple trick that you can just slap onto any learning material and expect it to magically work. There's a lot of nuance to it.
It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about understanding all these different factors and using them thoughtfully to create really effective learning experiences.
Right. And the researchers themselves point out some important limitations of the research in this area. For one thing, most of the studies they looked at focused on positive emotions. There's not much research yet on using emotional designs to create negative emotions, which could potentially be useful in certain contexts, like maybe for a safety training where you want people to feel a sense of urgency or caution.
I can see that. But yeah, you definitely don't want to make people feel anxious or frustrated while they're trying to learn something new. Unless that's the goal of the learning, I guess.
Exactly. Another limitation is that most of the participants in these studies were college students. So while we saw some interesting patterns for younger learners, more research is needed with different age groups to really understand how emotional designs affect learning across the lifespan.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how those effects change as people get older. And finally, there's always the issue of publication bias. The idea that studies showing positive results might be more likely to get published than studies showing negative or null results. And while the researchers did try to account for this, it's always something to keep in mind. It's a good reminder that no single study or meta-analysis can tell us everything. We have to keep questioning and exploring.
Okay, so to sum it all up, emotional designs in multimedia learning, they can be a powerful tool.
They can enhance learning outcomes, make people feel more motivated, and even improve their overall experience.
But it's not as simple as just throwing in some bright colors and smiley faces. There are a lot of factors to consider, and it's all about using those elements strategically and thoughtfully.
Exactly. So the next time you're taking an online course, watching a presentation, or even just reading a textbook, take a moment to really pay attention to the design elements. Think about how they're making you feel and whether those feelings are helping or hindering your learning. And if you're creating learning materials for others, think about how you can use these insights to design experiences that are not only informative, but also engaging and enjoyable.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more about this, we highly recommend checking out the original meta-analysis by Wang and Adesop from 2021. We'll put a link in the show notes.
And with that, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of emotional designs. It's an area that's constantly evolving, and we're excited to see what new discoveries come out in the future. Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.
Bye, everyone.